Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's webinar, Detecting Fraud Through Data Analytics. At this time, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Jeremy Clopton. Jeremy is a member of BKD's Forensics and Valuation Services Division and specializes in providing fraud investigation and forensic data mining services. He assists with fraud investigations through a variety of tasks, including interviewing employees, obtaining evidence, examining documents, analysis of large data sets, estimating losses, and presenting findings. Jeremy has experience in using both ACL and IDEA data analysis software for forensic data mining and continuous auditing. He is a frequent speaker on the topics of data analytics, continuous auditing, and forensic accounting, and in addition to his BA degree in accounting, Jeremy is a certified fraud examiner, ACL certified data analyst, and member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Again, thank you for participating in today's webinar. I will now turn it over to Jeremy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about detecting fraud through data analytics. And right off the bat, I would like to start off with a polling question for everyone. Would like to find out, does your organization incorporate data analytics into your fraud prevention and detection strategies? This can be anything from using ACL or IDEA, Microsoft Excel, any form of data analytics, just to try to get an idea as to what everybody is out there doing. So as you're answering the polling question, it looks like just over half the audience is using data analytics. That is outstanding to hear. The other, about 43%, either know or unsure. So we're going to talk a lot about what exactly is data analytics, why is it important, and what can you do to get this implemented in your organization. So how is fraud detected? The number on your screen is 7%, and this comes from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report to the nations. And this statistic jumps out at me very quickly. And this comes from the How Fraud is Detected that study. And essentially, this 7% represents the amount of fraud detected by accident. Now, I would argue that most people in here probably are not using by accident as one of your internal controls, and I would really hope that you are not. By accident is not an effective strategy for trying to identify fraud. And with the other statistics that come from that report to the nations, knowing that the average organization is losing approximately 5% of revenues to fraud every year, detecting 7% of fraud by accident is just not good. And we need to try to find a way that we can get around this and lower this number. And I think that data analytics is going to be one of the solutions to help you do that. Now, moving on through that report to the nations, if we look at the insurance industry, what are the most common fraud schemes that we're seeing? Right up at the top, we have billing and corruption. And billing can mean a number of things. That can be claims billing, claims submissions, because that isn't broken out specifically on here. Or it could be through accounts payable and vendors. And most commonly, when we hear of billing schemes, that's what we're talking about, or bills that come into the organization and funds that are going out the door through accounts payable. Billing schemes there, fictitious vendors, fake invoices, fabricated numbers, whatever the case may be. And that's followed very closely by corruption. And in this study, corruption is your conflicts of interest, your related parties, your unknown relationships between employees and vendors or customers, or those individuals that you represent as far as insurance provider. So corruption can be something that is very difficult to find, and there aren't a lot of items in most audit plans to identify corruption. So we need to come up with a little bit of a better way to do that. And data analytics can be used in both of these items right off the bat to help us identify these types of schemes. Now, 7% of fraud is detected by accident, and that's because historically we have all taken a very reactive approach to the way that we look for things. If we have a problem, we're going to look further into it. We might get into 50% or 75% analysis, but most of the time organizations aren't doing 100% analysis when they're in a reactive phase. And generally speaking, even when we don't have an issue, if we're trying to look through a data set and determine, do we have a problem, we're doing so by way of sampling. And sampling is also very ineffective when it comes to finding fraud, because most fraud schemes that we are seeing, at least in practice, there are not enough transactions to where they will show up in most samples, a sample of 30 or a sample of 50. To drive this point home a little bit, we're going to take a look at this next slide. And if everybody will make sure you focus on the screen for a moment, behind this black box, there is a picture. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw a 10% sample of this picture. And hopefully everybody will be able to tell what it is. So here's your 10% sample. And now everybody should be able to tell me exactly what is behind this black box. If sampling is truly effective for finding fraud and analyzing 100% of the population, hopefully this will tell you that you know exactly what that picture is. Now, everybody that's watching this webinar probably has absolutely no idea what is behind the box, so I'll show you. And you can see it is a field full of haystacks. Now, data analytics is always being referred to as finding the needle in the haystack. But I would argue if you don't know how many haystacks there are, how they're organized, or even if you're looking at haystacks, it's going to be very hard to find that needle, or needles in the case of multiple transactions. So we have to get away from this sampling mentality, pulling 30, pulling 40 or 50 items, maybe 1 or 2% of the population, and we need to get to where we're looking at 100% of the population. And data analytics is how you do that. Problems with that old method of sampling we've already discussed here. It's not effective, it's not real efficient. It does provide a little bit of hindsight, which can be good, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on currently. It tells you what happened in the past. Now, the final item on here is something that everybody is probably very familiar with, the term big data. You probably hear this day in and day out. It's in the media, it's on TV, it's on Twitter, it's on blogs, it's on just about every website related to data mining or how you can analyze data in your organization. But I would argue it isn't necessarily big data that you need to be worried about. Whether you have small data or medium-sized data, even if you have no idea how much data you have, the bottom line is every organization has data. In the insurance industry, you have great data because you have a lot of claims information, your accounts payable is very detailed, and you have a lot more detailed information than some other industries may have. Whether or not that's big data, I'm not sure for your organization, but the fact of the matter is you have data, you need to leverage that data so you can do the most effective testing for fraud prevention and detection. So let's look at what is a wish list for a new method. What exactly is going to take us from the dark ages of sampling and only looking at a small percentage of the population to find fraud to getting to a much more effective way to do that? Well, everybody on here has probably heard the phrase do more with less. Technology is what's going to help us do that. It's a little cliche, but it's still something that's out there. We also want something that's going to give us 100% coverage. We want to be a lot more effective in our testing. And then that bottom item on there, I don't want this to be overly complex. So I don't want something where I'm going to have to actually program and actually do some computer programming to try to analyze my data. What I'm looking for is simple, and that can be done whether you have an accounting background or whether you have an IT background or whether you have neither, you just have a business background. Now, the new method is not simply putting a bunch of data into a software solution, coming up here, hitting the find fraud button, and automatically fraud is going to appear. Now, that is not what data mining is. I know a lot of people may have that myth that you can just throw a bunch of data into a program, push a button, and it's going to show up. But that's not what data mining is, and that's not something that we're going to be able to do. However, we can be creative in how we do our data mining and our analytics, and we can get closer to being able to put data into a system, design procedures that will help direct us toward potentially detecting fraud that may be in our data sets. And it's also going to help us move along this responsiveness continuum. We're going to move away from sampling and being reactive. We're going to move toward being more proactive. We're going to have 100% coverage. Now, it's still going to be a little ad hoc. It's not going to be completely proactive. It's not going to be automated. But we are at least getting 100% coverage, and we can see what's going on in the data today. And that brings us to our next polling question. And that is, of those of you that are using data analytics in your organization, I'm very curious as to what software are you using in your organization. On the screen, you will see some of the choices up there are ACL and IDEA are probably two of the most common. IBM has a data analytics solution. And then there are others out there as well. And I'm curious, what data analytics software does your organization use? And that polling question is up on the screen now. All right, it looks like most of the group is using, that is actually using data analytics software is using ACL. It's very good to know. I appreciate that feedback there. what exactly is data analytics? This is a question that I get asked a lot, and I think it's important that we cover that real fast. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get into a lot of case studies and examples as to the way that we've used data analytics. Now, the new method of data analytics is essentially you're trying to identify what in the data is useful information. Is that an unusual pattern? Is it a trend? Is it a relationship? What exactly in that data is useful? And you may not know right off the bat, but using what's going on, what you've seen as far as potential fraud schemes, you can identify what some of those items might be. I've listed a few things that we find useful in our investigations. Conflicts of interest, unknown relationships. These things are very important. Control weaknesses might indicate somewhere where somebody could exploit the system and could commit fraud in the future. And you can also see abnormal patterns of activity. And finally there, that last bullet point, this is where we start not only providing hindsight and seeing what happened the last 3 years in our data, but we look at what happened in the past, what's happening now, and then we get insights as to what might happen in the future. So some of the most common data mining areas that we're seeing, vendors and accounts payable, always right up near the top. In the insurance industry, we see claims as an area where a lot of people are applying data analytics. Employees and payroll, that is also gaining popularity there, where we have some hours schemes, salary manipulation, potential fictitious employees, and nepotism policy violations. And then we get into our expense reimbursement and travel and entertainment, which go hand in hand. And then as all of the accountants that are watching the webinar will probably already look at, you'll see the general ledger on there. That is another area where data analytics is very popular. So now what I want to do is go through some of the analytics that we commonly see and that we commonly apply, and talk about some of the risks that you can address with those analytics. The first item on here is vendor attribute capture. And this is something that a lot of organizations and a lot of people don't really see as important. We set up our new vendors in the system, and we get the checks cut, and they go out the door, and we go on about the day. But if you're not looking at what information is being captured about your vendors, you could have some potential issues in here. If you look here on the screen, you can see that out of just over 69,000 vendors, this organization had 731 without an address. And you may look at that and you say, okay, 730 vendors out of 69,000, that's really not a lot. And in the grand scheme, it's a very small amount. It's probably not even material. However, the important thing to note here, all of the vendors that did not have an address were receiving checks. They had payments issued to them, though they had no address on file, which then begs the question, how can you mail a check to a vendor if you do not have the vendor's address? And the risk here is where you have a billing scheme. Somebody in the accounts payable department is in there cutting a check. It comes off the printer, and they can pick that check up and they can take it to their local bank. That's where you have potential fictitious vendors, potential fictitious billing. Now, one thing to keep in mind, a lot of this information may be captured on paper. Maybe it's just not electronic. So you need to evaluate in your organization, how are you capturing your information and what is critical to be captured electronically in the system. Maybe you don't need the tax ID number for everybody in the system, and that's fine. But I would argue if you cut checks electronically, you definitely need an address for every single vendor on file. This next slide here is looking at vendor activity over time. And a lot of systems allow you to deactivate or make inactive a vendor that you're no longer using in your system. Now, this system here, they had roughly 65 to 70,000 vendors. And you can see over time how many of those vendors are being used. And this slide here is actually looking at only active vendors in their system. Inactive vendors are not presented. So you can see of all of their active vendors that they have used 10,000 in the last year, another 15,000 if you look in total over the last 2 years. And if you go back over the last 4 years, we've only used about 25,000 vendors, which leaves us about 44,000 that we haven't used in over 4 years, but they're still active in our system. And you may think that that's not a big deal, but the problem here is if somebody in your organization knows how the processes work, and they know where your approval thresholds are for checks, maybe it's over 5,000, maybe it's over 10,000, those vendors with the pre-fiscal year 2009, last time they were active, those become high risk because you can go in and you can manipulate those vendors, you can change their addresses, you can put an address in the system if they didn't have it, and you have employees that could then actually funnel checks to themselves by way of these vendors. And I would love to tell you that if the check is made out to a vendor, that they could not take that to the bank and cash it. However, we've seen in the past few years that that is not actually the case. The employee can add their name to the back or to the front of the check. We've seen it handwritten in, or they could go as far as to set up a bank account in a similar name that is not exactly that vendor's. So, or they could even go in and just change the name of the vendor. So you want to make sure that you're actually reviewing your vendors and their activity and seeing how often are we using the vendors. And if you're not using your vendors, go in and deactivate them so you don't have to worry about them. The next area of actually getting into the data mining that I would encourage you to look at is name mining. And this is where we're looking for fictitious vendors. And this is those billing schemes again. And some of the things that we're seeing right off the bat, we see employees, you would think that they'd be creative, but they're really not. Employees are not necessarily creative when they're committing fraud, setting up fictitious vendors. And all too often, we'll see an employee that will simply put in their initials right before a consulting company. So for myself, I might set up JRC Consulting Company or JRC Design Company. And now I have a fictitious vendor. It does not have my name in it. However, it does have my initials. And maybe it's in the same city where I'm at and I'm sending it to a post office box. So those initials are what triggers me to know that that is the fictitious vendor in the system. So you want to look for instances where your employees' initials are showing up in your vendor names. And I would encourage you, if you haven't done this, do this using data analytics on the back end. Also, you can be very diligent. You can do this on your vendor due diligence at the setup point before it even gets into the system and becomes data. Points numbers 2 and 4 on here, anagrams and others. You know, anagrams in their purest form are where you take the letters from one name, rearrange them, and make another. As you can see on the screen there, we have David Cash and Chad Davis. But we also see where employees will go in and they'll transpose letters, which is still an anagram, but they'll transpose letters so they, you know, the vendor name looks as though it's misspelled. When in all actuality, it's still a legitimate vendor, and that's just the trigger to them that this is the one that I have set up. This is the one that's fictitious. This is the one that I can use. So that is another way that you can try to identify and, you know, look for those fictitious vendors. And a lot of times we see that with the vendors that have been inactive for a period of time and nobody is watching. Finally, on this, we have fictitious names, and the one example where the best example, I should say, where I've seen this, we were actually investigating a bank, looking through their loans, and they had a loan set up to Mickey Mouse. It was not abbreviated like this. It was actually spelled out just as though the Disney character Mickey Mouse. $10,000 loan on the book, still had an outstanding balance. And they really wanted to make this look legitimate. They went in there. Minnie Mouse was the cosigner, and they lived at Princess Ariel Parkway. Looked to be a completely valid loan set up on the books. In fact, it was a test account. It was a test loan that was not valid. But the fact of the matter is, nobody knew prior to us looking through their loan file that they even had this set up, other than the individual that set up that loan, which goes to show that it can be very easy to set up a fictitious loan in that case, or a fictitious vendor nonetheless. So you want to be aware as to names and just look through who the checks are being cut to. Sometimes you can just flip through pages. I would encourage you to actually, look at some statistics using data analytics to try to determine who are you cutting your checks to, what's the trend of activity over time, look at the vendor names and see if they make sense. Fictitious or famous names are sometimes used in these fictitious vendor schemes. Now, the next area is where we get into the employee-vendor relationships. And this is where you're looking for not necessarily an employee's name in the vendor name. Maybe you set up your employees to where they can have expense reimbursements, and if that's the case, you expect to see those. What we're looking for here are instances where the employee name and the vendor name are different, but they have other attributes that match, such as address, phone number, or tax ID number. And this is where that vendor attribute capture becomes very important. You can see on the screen here that we have Jeremy Clopton matches up with a vendor. This is from a real case that we have worked on. I've changed the names. And in this case, Jeremy and the vendor, they matched on the same address. And you can see there the picture of the house. And what the issue here is that we now have a vendor set up at an employee's residence. Now, it's only $16,000 in payments, and that's over 3 years, which may not appear as though that's an issue. But in this organization's case, there was a state statute that prohibited an employee having any interest in a vendor that the organization used. So here it went from a $16,000 in payments that wasn't a big deal to now all of a sudden we have a state statute being violated because of the employee has the interest in the vendor. So we want to look for some of the things where we have the same address between an employee and a vendor. Another example of that. In this case, we have a conflict of interest. It was only $5,700 in payments over 3 years. But you can see here both the husband and wife have the same address as the vendor. And in fact, the husband has the same tax ID number as the vendor. So now we have a huge issue because, again, this organization has a statute that prohibits, or the state where this organization was had a statute prohibiting this type of a relationship. And they knew exactly what this vendor, the organization knew the vendor, they knew exactly what they got from the vendor, they knew the employees, but they had no idea that those employees actually owned the vendor. So here's where we want to find the conflicts of interest. This didn't turn out to be fraudulent, but that could very well have been corruption, and it could have been a very, very complex billing scheme that could be found the same way. For those of you that are out there looking for vendor-employee matches and you're doing some data analytics around that with the address, one small tip that I'll throw out there is you probably want to look at just the numbers in the address and the numbers in the zip code. That's going to help you with some spelling issues, and it's going to get you a little bit better matching based on the address than you might otherwise receive. Once we get into address mining, here we're going to get into mailbox services. And mailbox services, they're the new post office box type. Historically, post office boxes have been used for fictitious vendor schemes because they're anonymous. You can't verify who owns them. But a lot of organizations now are requiring that you have a physical address for a vendor, which is great. The problem is UPS stores, FedEx Kinkos, mailboxes, etc. Any of these mail drop type services give you the appearance of a physical address. On your screen, you can see Syntec Corporation is located at 1221 East Kearney. Problem here is that is also a UPS store, so that's not a valid address for that corporation as far as verifying their existence. What's more is if we start looking at proximity with the actual employees in the system, you can see that this corporation is set up within 0.2 of a mile of an AP clerk. And in fact, this is the AP clerk that set up that vendor. Now, we look at it here, it's not exactly clear as to what the big deal is, but once we actually map all this out and we look at it with the employer, we can see that every day on their way home, the employee drives right next to that UPS store where that vendor is set up. And in this case, the employee was actually routing checks to a fictitious vendor through the UPS store, and they were picking them up on their way home. I've also heard other instances where somebody has done this with post office boxes in their home city. And you want to not only look at mailbox services, but also proximity, where you're getting the latitude and longitude for your vendors, your employees, maybe those that are filing claims, and you're looking at where are they located, because that proximity can be very, very important. Another example of why proximity is so important is here on this next slide. You can see that there's a design company set up on 5th Street, and there's an employee set up on Oak Street. The problem here is 5th Street and Oak Street are at an intersection right where that employee lives. And conveniently, that's also the address of the design company. So you may not always have something that appears to be the same address, but if you map that out as kind of a visual analytics, this is going to help you identify the fact that, in fact, 123 5th Street and 4300 Oak Street are the same address. And again, that can be very problematic if you have conflict of interest requirements or if you have any potential related parties that you want to be aware of at your organization. So you need to be aware who are your vendors, who are your employees, and where they're located. Another example on proximity analysis, this proximity analysis has been one way that we have identified quite a few issues in vendor files and in investigations over the last few years. In this case, we have an AP manager set up right next to Vinny's Salvage Yard. And the interesting thing here, if you look at it, is Vinny's Salvage Yard actually has a swimming pool in the backyard, which is probably the nicest salvage yard in America and won't be long before they have their own Discovery Channel reality show. But the problem is the AP manager and Vinny are very good friends. Turns out that this organization, they went in and they reviewed this. That is not allegedly the salvage yard. That is actually Vinny's home residence, which is the address given. Vinny and the AP manager are great friends. Turned out nothing had been done improperly with that vendor. All the payments were legitimate. They were providing a great service. But due to the fact that there was that potential conflict, this organization decided that, in fact, they were no longer going to be doing business with that salvage yard. And the final item on proximity, showed you a little earlier where we look at latitude and longitude. We calculate the distance between the two in feet, try to determine, okay, we're within a tenth of a mile, a quarter of a mile. Sometimes there's something to be said for just looking at it as a picture. And on your screen here, what we have is we have a couple different colors of push pins. You can see black push pins. These represent the vendors. The red push pins represent the employees. And this organization, as you can tell, is located up near Los Angeles. They also have a location down in San Diego. That's not really our problem. What the problem is are these two push pins out in the middle of the California desert. And you can see here that there is a black push pin and there's a red push pin. The red push pin is actually the executive secretary to the president of the organization, and the black push pin is a casino. And the casino was actually set up legitimately about 5 years prior to our investigation. And this employee is not the focus of our initial investigation. They set up the casino as a legitimate vendor, and they were out there for an employee event. The problem is the executive secretary after that determined that they could have parties out at that casino, and they could fund all of those parties through the company. So family and friends, New Year's, birthdays, anniversaries, all of these parties, invoices were being submitted to the organization, and that company was actually paying for some of those parties. Like I said, this individual, they were not actually the focus of our investigation to start with, but by the time we were done with this procedure, they were the focus of a secondary investigation that started not too long thereafter. Moving away from the vendor and employee side, the attribute type of things, now we're going to move into more of the financial, the check details. And we're going to focus in on accounts payable because this is an area that, no matter what type of insurance you have, everybody is cutting checks out the door through accounts payable. And I think that the concepts that apply to AP can also apply to claims payable. So I think there's a lot of overlaps. I want to focus in on this a little bit for you all. In the vendor trending on your screen, you can see that we have, this is what we call an acceleration pattern. And this describes, in a picture, essentially what most fraud schemes that we see as far as kickbacks or potential related parties, conflicts of interest, this is a lot of times what they look at. Employees aren't going to start stealing a $1 million check at once. That would probably get caught. So they're going to start small, $10, $50, maybe $100 at a time. You can see that's the test phase there over in early 2006. Then as their confidence builds, they take a little bit more here, take a little bit more there, and then by the end, you get that very rapid acceleration because they realize nobody's looking, and that a lot of times is where it ends up getting caught because they get over greedy and it accelerates too quickly, and that's when things actually a lot of times can start to unravel. But this pattern is common in a lot of fictitious vendor schemes, a lot of fraud schemes, and if you're not actually trending your vendor activity, I would highly encourage you to do so. You can do something as simple as a spark line in Microsoft Excel or a crosstab in ACL that can help you get an idea very quickly as to what your trending looks like. It's a little rudimentary and it may not be the most efficient, but it is a way that if you have a vendor and you have their activity over time that you can start to get a picture of it and see what it looks like. Some of the other trends that we look at here, not only acceleration patterns, but also valley and spike patterns. And the spike patterns here, that's where you have a vendor that has pretty standard activity, and all of a sudden just 1 month is huge. Those we want to look at because we want to make sure that it isn't a large check going out the door, or it's not a lot of little checks going out the door, where it's a one-time abuse of a vendor. And then going back to one of the very early slides that I showed you in the vendors on the activity assessment, that valley pattern that you can see in the middle right of your screen, that's essentially what it looks like when somebody starts manipulating a vendor that has been active for quite some time, and then they realize that they can, use that vendor for a fictitious scheme. So here you can see that there's quite a few quarters of non-activity, and all of a sudden it starts picking up again pretty small and accelerates over time. So you have a combination of two patterns there. But that pattern right there is pretty indicative of an inactive vendor that is now being abused by somebody in the organization. Some other payment trends that you can do, you can look at payment trends by month. You can look at them by day of month. This can be, if you're looking at claims, if you have a lot of claims right at the end of the month, if you have a lot right at the beginning of the month, some unusual timing, if you have any deadlines, you want to look at those. One that every organization that's watching this webinar should likely be doing, if you're not already, look at your AP checks by day of week. You can do this in virtually any software program, Excel, ACL, IDEA, anything with analytics, you can do this. If you are not open on the weekends, you should not have checks cut on Saturdays or Sundays. One thing to keep in mind, if your check date is the date that it is posted rather than the date that it is issued, that may skew your results, but you want to be looking at your checks by day of week. I had an investigation 2 weeks ago that I was working on. We ran this test. We found 20 checks issued on a Saturday. Each and every single one of them was fraudulent, and it was part of the scheme that was being perpetrated at that organization. And the test takes about 2 minutes. That's all it took to run. It was very quick, and it helped us identify exactly what this individual was doing, and helped us identify the scheme and then unravel it even more. Pretty simple analytic to be doing, and I would encourage everybody to be doing that analytic. Another one here that we'll talk about briefly, and I won't go into the great statistics detail, but Benford's Law essentially says that if you take a set of numbers, the first digit on the left side should be a 1 more often than a 2, then a 3, then a 4, then a 5, and so on. Same applies to the second and third and fourth and fifth digits, but to a lesser degree. And here's where this becomes very, very useful. Here we're going to look at accounts payable, and you can see, just looking at the screen here, the red line represents Benford's Law expected. The blue columns represent actual. The 1s are a little high, not by much. The 5s are a little high, not by much. So everything looks decent here. It's when we start looking at the second digit that we can see that we have a huge issue. You know, the 0s and the 5s are way out of whack here, and you could say that all the other numbers are as well because they're low. But keep in mind, Benford's is built on proportion. So if the 0s and 5s are high, everything else is likely low. In this case, and this could, you know, at this organization, it was refund checks to some of their patients. It was a healthcare organization. They were cutting refund checks, $10, $20, $25, and $50 checks. The problem here, they were not fraudulent. The problem is they did not know how many refund checks they were cutting. They had a policy issue or a procedural issue, and accounting had no idea they were cutting that many checks. A lot of times, Benford's Law will help point you in the right direction to look for anomalies in your data. It does not mean that it's fraud. In this case, it was not, but it can help point you in a direction that you want to focus. Another example of that is here. This is an expense account example, but I think it's incredibly useful because here you have a receipt threshold of $25. You have an expense of $25 or higher, you have to turn in a receipt. So what do you have? You have employees turning in receipts of $21 through $24, and a lot of waiters and waitresses that aren't getting very big tips because nobody wants to turn in receipts. And this works anywhere where you have approval thresholds. If you have 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, you can use Benford's Law to identify potential instances where somebody is trying to get around those thresholds and they're keeping it just under. You can see here we have the 21 through 24 spikes. If you have a $5,000 threshold, it's probably going to spike around 48 and 49. So a couple different ways to use Benford's Law than people might otherwise think. Another very quick analysis. In this example, we had an investigator in the field and was trying to identify accounts payable checks that were not recorded in the GL. Had an 8-inch stack of green bar paper for everybody that can remember what green bar paper is. That included the GL, the cash receipts, and the accounts payable and payroll. And he was going to have to identify every single check not recorded for 5 years. And you can only imagine how long that would take and how inefficient that process would be. We used ACL for this. It took about 30 minutes, and we identified every single gap in that check sequence over that 5-year period. Turned out to be about a $450,000 fraud. Those checks didn't get recorded in the GL, but they did clear the bank. Credit cards, cruise lines, friends and family. These checks were going everywhere. So that's something that you may want to consider as another procedure for you to do. Look at your check sequence analysis. You can do this in ACL. You can do it in IDEA. You can do it in Excel. A lot of ways to do this analysis. You can do it in Microsoft Access for that matter. And you want to make sure that if you have a check that's missing from your sequence, that it did not clear the bank. Purchasing cards is another area that I'd like to touch on here real fast. You know, purchasing cards, they're high risk. A lot of organizations think, and I would agree, if they're not properly monitored, they can be very high risk. In this case, the bank has a control that says that that the second individual on the list in public health has a $1,000 transaction limit. But when we looked at it, we actually had one receipt. So the transaction occurred on one receipt, so it's essentially one transaction, and it was for $1,400. So what we had here was a control breakdown. It was not fraudulent, but it was a control breakdown that could have led to some fraudulent purposes. So In this case, the organization had to go back to the bank and talk with them about how exactly do the controls work and how could they help enhance those for the future. In payroll, hours is an area a lot of people really look at earnings and dollars, but look at the hours. This can be something that can be very useful as well. In this case, we're looking at overtime hours, and this is a 15-month period, and we actually had an employee that had 654 hours of overtime in 15 months. This was a position in this organization that should not have had any overtime whatsoever, and the organization had never looked at cumulative payroll totals. All they looked at was at a period in time, and if it was approved by the supervisor, it was okay. What we had here was a supervisor that wasn't being very diligent and was approving anything that came across without really looking at it. The organization had no idea that they had a single person that had this much overtime. So a very quick thing to look at there. Vacation hours, this is a very easily abused area. I want to draw everybody's attention here to the November to January timeframe, about 3/4 across the screen. 426 hours of vacation in 15 months is a lot of vacation in 15 months. That employee is not working much, and you can see here that they really didn't work from November to January much at all. So that's something that you want to be looking at. That's an analysis that you can do very quickly. This graph was generated in Microsoft Excel. Holiday hours. This is probably the one type of hour that is going to be the most standardized across everybody in your organization. In this organization, 134 hours was standard, and we actually had an employee that was able to get 182 hours of holiday time during that period. The amazing part was the holiday hours, over 40 hours of holiday time in the 2 weeks into January 20th of 2012. I can maybe come up with one holiday, but definitely cannot come up with more than 40 hours of holiday in that time period, and that's something that you can look at very quickly. And this is more of a visual analytic, and that's what we're looking at here. We've talked about some different types of analytics that are more visual. We've talked about the mapping. We've looked at holiday hours, both very visual types of analytics. An example from somebody I talked with last week at a presentation I was doing, and what they were looking at were cell phone insurance claims. And they had a couple schemes in their organization where they had found people were filing claims and then following UPS trucks around and picking up the new phones out of the mailboxes. And what they had done is they had actually mapped out where all of the claims were and looked at them on a map to identify streets where somebody could be going up and down the streets within a neighborhood to get these cell phones, these new cell phones that had been essentially obtained through fraudulent claims. And that's another type of visual analytics that you can be doing. So with that in mind, another polling question for everybody. Does your organization use data visualization as an analysis technique? And this doesn't have to be incredibly sophisticated New York Times style data visualizations. It doesn't have to be an infographic. But do you have any type of data visualization, looking at graphs, looking at maps, that you are using as an analysis technique? All right, so we do have a few out there, about 20%, 21% that is, and the remainder is not. If you're not already using data visualization as a technique, I would recommend start using some graphs, even if it is as basic as Microsoft Excel graphs. That can be very useful. Some other areas of application of data analytics here, access logs, maintenance files. We talked about purchasing cards, employee reimbursements a little bit. A new area of application, and this actually read this article so recently that I wasn't able to create a slide for it, but social media is another area where you can implement data analytics. I read an article on the ACFE's website here within the last week about a workers' compensation fraud where the employee, they actually found out that it was fraudulent because she was on The Price is Right, had a shoulder injury that she was claiming as workers' compensation, yet she was able to spin the big wheel. Now, not sure that they went out and mined Facebook and Twitter and all other social media, but I would almost assure you most employees, if they are on The Price is Right, you're going to be able to find that through social media. So looking at social media that's it's out there, it's on the internet, it's publicly available. I would encourage you possibly to consider how you might be able to use some analytics there as well. We've talked about some of these, but some other tools to consider again. Microsoft Excel, SQL, ACL, IDEA, SAS Analytics are just a few. So now I want to talk to kind of wrap up the last 10 minutes here is, what's next? We've talked about data analytics provides a little bit of insight. We're still getting the hindsight, but how are we really moving ahead? And that's really automated testing. A lot of people might have heard the phrase continuous auditing, and that's really analytics at the speed of business, and that's where we're moving to. It's automated analytics, it's 100% coverage, and not necessarily in real time, but it is something that is done at the speed of business. If it's employee vendor matching, maybe you don't add enough vendors, a month to even warrant doing it monthly. Maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's annually. Whatever the case may be, if that's the speed of business from that business process, that can be continuous auditing. Now, the best example I've ever heard of this was Lockheed Martin. And they have over 100,000 employees and spend over $1 billion, and that's billion with a B, over $1 billion a year on purchasing cards. We've talked about how high risk those are, but in their organization, they actually get their data daily and can follow up on any transaction that is deemed unusual based on a 12 to 18 point analytic red flag system that they have. They can follow up on a transaction within 48 hours of occurrence. And that's pretty darn continuous in my book. I don't know that you can get much more continuous. And for that business process for them, that is the speed of business, so that's continuous auditing. A couple examples for you. A manufacturing organization we've done this with. They have they had 20 operating divisions, lots of employees and vendors, and they were looking for those conflicts of interest. Now for them, annually, that's about as quick as they need it to be. That's the speed of their business. It doesn't have to be monthly, doesn't have to be quarterly. Looking for duplicate payments for them, with 20 operating divisions, it's very likely they will have duplicate payments, and they're working toward getting that to where it's monthly. That way they're not having to look back 2 or 3 years at a time, but every month they can assess whether or not they have potential duplicate payments. Same thing on duplicate payments here for a university that I've seen this applied at as well. They decided they were going to go with a quarterly analysis for duplicate payments because that was about as quick as they needed to. And then for their purchasing cards, they were trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. Do we have people trying to split their transactions to get around limits? And in that case, again, they decided quarterly was the speed of their business. Now, if you are talking about continuous auditing in-house, a couple things to keep in mind. Continuous auditing is owned by the internal audit department. It's process-focused. Recommendations come from that. Continuous monitoring is owned by management. It's more control-focused. And if management sees an issue, they can make a policy change right then and there. So, that's the difference between the two. If you've heard the two terms used, a lot of the procedures can be the same, but not always. Now, I always like to leave anybody that listens to one of my webinars or attends a presentation with some takeaways. So I'm going to provide everyone here a plan that will get you, if you have no analytics right now, a plan to get you going on data analytics. If you're already doing some and you want to take it to the next level and get to continuous auditing, help get you to that point as well. Okay, it's a 6-step process that we're going to use to get to data analytics or make our data analytics even more robust than they currently are. The first step is assessing risk. You have to know what your risks are in your organization. And when you do this, you have to consider the data. If you're not looking at the data, it's going to be really hard to come up with data analytics to identify, to address a risk if you don't have any data. So you want to assess your risk. And one thing to keep in mind is data could be your risk. If you look at the screen here, you can see my favorite line here is the second one. Missouri, MO, MIS, MISS, MZ. All of those are actual abbreviations that we have seen for the state of Missouri in some of our projects and investigations. Now, I'm not exactly sure how you come up with some of these abbreviations, especially MS, since that's actually a different state altogether. But if you have data that looks like that, maybe data quality is a risk, and that needs to be something that you address. So, look at the data, start thinking about the data early, maybe start talking to IT about the data at this point. And really, when you're assessing your risk, is data a risk that we need to be considering? Once we know what our risks are, we can go to the next step, which is defining our objectives. Okay, what do we want to accomplish? And in this case, I recommend go for the low-hanging fruit, go for the stuff that's easy. A lot of times, employee vendor matching is one of the easiest types of tests to implement in an organization because it has great data and normally it's high quality. So define your objectives, get those quick wins. You don't want to pick something that's going to take 8 months to implement. You want it to be something that's going to be quick so you can succeed very quickly right off the bat. Now, the third step here, well, the first two are probably the most important. This third one is everybody's, I think, least favorite when I talk with them, and sometimes it's the most challenging. We're going to have to obtain the data, which does mean talking with IT. Hopefully nobody groaned too much there when I said that, but talk with IT early in the process and start figuring out what exactly you need to get. Now, some things to keep in mind: you want to make sure that you get your data for your analysis as well as the data that you're going to need for your follow-up. That way you don't have to go back and get it later. Also, if you're going for continuous auditing, you may consider a direct access to the database through an ODBC connection. If not, you want to talk with IT early and tell them you want to schedule this out. It's going to be automated. You're going to need the files on a routine basis, and tell them what that routine basis is. I assure you, if you talk with IT early, try to make this process as easy for them and as easy for you as possible. The more lead time you give yourself, the easier that's going to be. Once you have the data, now we're to developing and applying the procedures. And this is where you can use a little creativity. And yes, I realize everybody may be accountants, and creativity and accounting normally don't go real well together. But in this case, we need to be creative. What procedures are we going to use? They're going to help us achieve our objectives. To do that, here is just a guideline for progression. First thing, develop it one procedure at a time. You don't have to develop everything under the sun at once. Develop one at a time. Once you get that test down, automate it. Create a script for it. Make it a repetitive individual test. I have that bottom box as groups of similar tests. That's nothing high tech. Just keep a list. Here are all my tests that accomplish this goal in this area. Here are all of my tests over here that accomplish goal in this area. Go from there. Once you have those similar tests, you can group them together. And then from there, you can automate them and schedule them. That way you have your repetitive tests right off the bat. Now, after we develop and apply the procedures, we get to what everybody's familiar with. We're going to analyze the results, and we're going to manage the results. Something to keep in mind here: if you're going for continuous auditing, you have to get buy-in on the timing. If you want to do something every week, you're going to have to get a quicker response time than 2 months. So you want to consider, what exactly do you need on managing the results? Now, these 6 steps here: assess the risk, define the objectives, obtain the data, develop and apply procedures, analyze and manage your risks. For your organization, our 4th polling question: what of those phases is most challenging? Now, I have grouped a couple of these: assessing risk and defining objectives together, and then analyzing and managing risks. But what is the most challenging for your organization? I have my guess as to what I think it's going to be, but I'm curious to hear what everybody on the line is facing, and what you can do there. Kind of what I was guessing. Obtaining the data is a lot of times the hardest thing and the biggest challenge for a lot of organizations. Developing the procedures, sometimes that creativity can be a problem. Hopefully having that guide will help you get something up and going and off the ground in your organization. Some resources here: I always like to give some resources out so you all can look into it. The IAA's GTAG series 3, 13, and 16, the names of them are listed here and are going to be in the handouts. Highly encourage you to look at those. The second one there actually will list out risk areas, what data you need, and what you need to do to address those risk areas, and tests you can perform. If you're trying to sell data analytics internally, the ISACA white paper is outstanding. And then I list ACL and Automation. Automation is the idea distributor. I recommend looking at those sites, not necessarily just for the software, but for the ideas that they're going to provide you on how to apply their software in your organization or in your industry. You don't have to use their software to do it. You can use those ideas to get a jump start as to where you want to go. Later in the slides, you will see my contact information. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Twitter or on our blog at bkdforensics.com. And we'll post resources and guides and just some information that could be useful to you there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal, and I thank you all very much for your time.
Okay, we will now open the session for questions.
Looks like the first question that we have is, what is the easiest area to apply data analytics if I don't have anything going in my organization? And probably the easiest area is that vendors and accounts payable area. A lot of times there's really good data there. Employee vendor matching is a concern in a lot of organizations. So, that is, it's that low-hanging fruit, so to speak. It's an easy area of application where you can get a quick win and get management buy-in pretty quickly. So I'd recommend probably vendors and accounts payable is one of the easiest areas to apply data analytics. Looks like the next question that we have is, I don't have any of the software, ACL or IDEA. What can I do with just Microsoft Excel, or what I might have, Access, I'm guessing is another thing you might have there. There are a lot of things that you can do as far as sequencing, looking for some duplicates. You want to use the formulas to your advantage, the countifs, the sumifs, um, and try to look at the sequencing day of week, focusing in on some of those key attributes there. Explore the features of the pivot tables, and also the Sparklines feature in Excel 2010. Those are some things that you can do, with just some of the basic software tools that virtually every organization has, just to kind of get you up and going off the ground. The other thing that you can do is, reach out to others in your industry, LinkedIn groups, reach out to those that, offer assistance with that, look for training, and, just, looking at those resources online to give you ideas is something that can help you with that as well. And it looks like that is all the questions we have. Again, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you attending the webinar today.
Thanks again for attending our webinar. Please watch for upcoming insurance industry webinar and articles on bkd.com. Have a great day.